The young spearman pulls his cloak tighter, trying desperately to ward off the biting wind. As their feet crunch through the snowdrifts, the Carthaginian soldiers have little time to marvel at the majestic peaks that surround them. They have braved unfamiliar weather, hostile natives, and precarious terrain to reach their goal, Italia, home of their hated Roman enemies. For 17 years, Carthage and Rome have vied for supremacy in the Mediterranean, with the great city of Rome spared the horrors of war. But with this march, the Carthaginians plan to change that. The spearman's musings are interrupted by a shout. With a final roar, a war elephant loses its footing and plummets into an alpine crevasse, taking a handful of men with it. He pulls his cloak tighter. Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. The ancient Mediterranean was the scene of an epic clash between two empires to determine who would control the area, the Roman Republic and the Carthaginian Empire. Carthage initially enjoyed good relations with the Romans, but as the two powers quickly grew into the lead players of the Western Mediterranean stage, conflict became inevitable. In this video, we will examine the Punic Wars from the Carthaginian perspective, the conflict in which the largely mercantile empire fought for its very survival against the Romans, and how it ultimately fell beneath the talons of the Roman eagle. I'm incredibly excited to say that this video is sponsored by Total War Rome Remastered. I was given this game a few weeks before release to record a little bit of gameplay footage, and accidentally sunk 40 hours into forming an empire and marching on the city of Rome. The original Total War Rome was probably one of my favorite games as a kid, and though I was hesitant about this remaster at first, the people at Feral Interactive, in my opinion, did a fantastic job in bringing this classic title to the modern age while still keeping its feel the same. Rome Remastered has got updated 4K visuals, extensive gameplay improvements, many of which are actually toggleable if you prefer the original systems, as well as much needed performance optimization. Multiplayer is up and working, and 16 previously unplayable factions have been added to the Grand Campaign. The Barbarian Invasion and Alexander expansions are also included too, making it super replayable. And speaking of replayability, there is Steam Workshop for this game, and the modding tools are fantastic. I genuinely recommend picking up this remaster if you enjoy history and strategy games, and you can support our channel in the process by using the link in the description below. By the 3rd century BC, Carthage had grown into a true power of the Mediterranean. The Carthaginians shunned absolute rulers in favor of a republic, placing administrative authority into the hands of a suffet elected annually by a senatorial body consisting of the richest families in the city. Family lineage played no part in Carthaginian politics. Power came from wealth, and wealth flowed in from overseas trade. Carthage steadily expanded its mercantile influence across northern Africa and out into the Mediterranean, establishing prosperous colonies in Iberia, Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. Meanwhile, the disparate peoples of the Italian peninsula were being steadily united under one banner, the Roman eagle. At first, relations between the two powers were amicable, allowing the Carthaginians to open mutually beneficial trade routes. This amenity was shattered when the city-state of Messene approached both the Romans and Carthaginians, offering up its fealty in exchange for protection from invasion. Roman and Carthaginian detachments were sent to Messene, but the Punic forces arrived first, hastily securing the citadel. But when the inhabitants of Messene heard that the Romans were drawing near, they very politely asked the Carthaginians to get the hell out. The freshly evicted Carthaginians could only watch as the Romans marched into Messene, stealing what was briefly their holding. Outraged, the Carthaginians turned around and laid siege to the city alongside Messene's rival city-state of Syracuse. The First Punic War had begun. It wasn't long before the Romans took the initiative, sallying forth to defeat the besiegers in detail, first luring in the Syracusan forces, then, after defeating them, dealing with the Carthaginians alone. After hiring mercenaries to replace their Syracusan allies, who swiftly made peace with Rome, the Carthaginians moved their regular forces to Achragos to consolidate with their hired help. The Romans laid siege to Achragos and bottled up the Carthaginian regulars. The trapped soldiers, under a general named Hannibal, wait no, not that one, sallied forth to break the siege, and Carthage sent their newly hired mercenaries to assist. It did not go well. The war in Sicily ground to a stalemate, with Carthage waging a guerrilla war from their remaining strongholds as the Romans consolidated control of the island. Desperate to challenge Carthage on all fronts, the Latins supposedly copied the design of a wrecked Punic ship and built an entire fleet to wrest control of the seas from their opponents. The two fleets met at Mylae, and using their tried-and-true tactic of closing distance to ram their foes and split their ships to splinters, the Punic fleet were confident that their numbers would carry the day. But the Roman ships dropped spiked bridges from their prows the moment their foes were in ramming range, locking the Carthaginians in place and allowing marines to board. Using clever engineering, the Romans turned naval combat, at which they had no experience, into land combat, at which they were experts. The Romans followed up Mylae with a stunning victory at Cape Eknomos, paving the way for an invasion of North Africa. Fearing that the Romans would head straight for the capital, Punic forces frantically prepared their defenses, only to find they wouldn't be needed. The Romans landed elsewhere in Tunisia, and a hastily assembled force of Spartan mercenaries met them in the field, but for the Romans, it did not go well. Other skirmishes on the African coast and storms in the Straits of Sicily kept the Romans away from Carthage and forced the war into a stalemate. And so Carthage ruled the waves, and Rome ruled Sicily. At this point, Rome and Carthage had been at each other's throats for almost 20 years. The Romans took advantage of the quiet to build a third and final fleet, with which they smashed the Carthaginians at the Battle of Agates Islands before blockading the surviving Carthaginians in Sicily. Cut off from all supply, the Carthaginians were forced to submit. The First Punic War was over. Carthage emerged from the war facing challenges internal and external. The war had been extensively financed by the efforts of Hanno the Great, an immensely powerful and influential Carthaginian senator who had personally conquered large swaths of African territory. In 241 BC, a full-scale mutiny broke out amongst Carthage's mercenaries, which grew into a general revolt. Hanno raised a force to defend the capital, a task he barely succeeded at. As the situation steadily worsened, the Senate was forced to beg Rome for assistance. Remarkably, Rome obliged, sending large shipments of grain to feed the populace and even releasing thousands of prisoners from their previous war. These men were quickly snapped up by Hamilcar Barca, a popular commander in the guerrilla campaigns in Sicily and the father of Hannibal. Yes, that one. Hamilcar set out on his own campaign against the rebels in 240 BC, chalking up a string of victories and humiliating Hanno. While the two Carthaginian generals were busy fighting in Africa, the revolt spread to the garrisons of Sardinia and Corsica, and Rome took advantage of the mayhem to seize the islands. Carthage objected, but Rome insisted, so Carthage backed down. As tension built, a second war was inevitable, but Carthage wanted time to prepare. To Hamilcar Barca, this concession was a blatant act of betrayal. He had staked both his family fortune and military reputation on the outcome of the First Punic War. Hanno, however, was quick to point out that Hamilcar was in large part responsible for the Truceless War, having sent his mercenaries home to Africa after promising them lavish bonuses that the Senate in Carthage had never actually agreed to. Hamilcar struck back, decrying the Senate as nothing more than a collection of rich merchants who had grown fat and lazy while his men suffered and died in the fields and waters around Sicily. The Carthaginian Popular Assembly rallied behind Hamilcar, having come to regard him as a savior who stood against the corruption of the Senate. Leveraging the wounded pride of his countrymen to its fullest extent, Hamilcar declared that he would take his army west and conquer Iberia, securing the natural riches of the land to both pay off Carthaginian war debt and prepare the nation for what he saw as an inevitable second conflict with the treacherous Romans. Faced with civil war if they refused, Hanno and his allies gave their begrudging consent, and Hamilcar immediately set out on his new expedition. He would never return. Prior to abandoning his home, Hamilcar had made lavish sacrifices to the Carthaginian gods. During these ceremonies, his son Hannibal swore a binding oath to never be a friend of Rome. For nearly a decade, Hamilcar led his private army to war with the tribes of Iberia, securing access to the large silver and gold mines in the Sierra Morena mountain range, and linking them directly to the coast via inland waterways. Hamilcar quickly became one of the richest men in ancient history. But although the gods seemed to have blessed his endeavors, he would not live long enough to do more than build the foundations for a new war against Rome. At some point during 228 BC, the great general was killed in combat, leaving his sons in charge of both the army and the enormous wealth he had accrued. Fortunately for the late Hamilcar, the Barcid family he left behind was more capable of living up to his legacy. His sons Hannibal and Hasdrubal were now teenagers and had already demonstrated talent equal to their father. Hamilcar's army was both loyal and confident, consisting of hardened veterans who had fought and bled with the family since the days of the First Punic War. For the next 10 years, the Barcid brothers worked with their uncle to secure and expand their control over Iberia. But this was a preamble to greater plans. In 218 BC, Hannibal attacked the Roman-allied city of Seguntum. In response to this sudden aggression, the Romans sent an envoy to the Carthaginians, demanding that the son of Hamilcar be turned over to them for execution. But the envoy found himself confronted by a hostile Carthaginian senate and a popular assembly that stood united with the mighty Barcid family. In a dramatic confrontation, the envoy declared before the senate that he carried within his toga both war and peace. The Carthaginians could choose what they preferred. The story goes that with one voice, the senate roared back their response: war. Having secured the backing of the Senate, Hannibal traveled to the city of New Carthage to assemble his army. After entrusting his brother, Hasdrubal, with about 13,000 men to defend Iberia, Hannibal took a vast number of infantrymen and cavalry, along with 37 war elephants, and marched north in late June. He easily crossed the Pyrenees into Gaul, taking an indirect route to avoid Rome's allies in the region. Even so, Hannibal encountered resistance at the Rhone River when a Gallic tribe known as the Allobroge formed up on the opposite bank to block his advance. Thinking quickly, Hannibal sent a division north to ford the river and outflank the entrenched barbarians, then rushed across while they were distracted. The Gauls dispersed, leaving the road clear to the Alps. Hannibal arrived at the foot of the mountains. As soon as he began his ascent, problems began. After fighting off an Allobroge ambush in the mountain pass, Hannibal encountered a local tribe offering to act as guides. Trusting them nearly proved a fatal mistake, as the Carthaginians were led to the edge of a deep ravine and a second ambush. Barely driving off the treacherous Gauls, Hannibal's army was finally able to rest in the shelter provided by a large white rock formation. Hannibal encouraged his men to go forward, and the exhausted Carthaginians began their descent. After 15 days in the mountains and 5 months on the march since leaving New Carthage, 26,000 exhausted, bedraggled men stumbled out of the Alps and onto the fertile Italian plains. Despite losing nearly half of his army and most of his elephants, Hannibal had accomplished something previously thought impossible. and his enemies were completely ignorant of the danger that had just arrived on their doorstep. His first encounter with Rome occurred in late November in the Po Valley, where his Numidian horsemen decisively routed the Roman equites. Hannibal pursued his foes to their camp on the river Trebia, where he caught them fording the icy river. Rome's superior numbers were worth little against Carthaginian attacks along the Roman flank, led by Hannibal's younger brother, Mago. Within hours, the 40,000 legionaries were surrounded, with 30,000 killed or captured as Hannibal's men plundered their camp for supplies. Hannibal wasted no time pressing deeper into Italy. In preparing for an ambush along Lake Trasimene, the Punic army detoured through a swamp, where Hannibal tore his own eye out to avoid dying from an infection. It was worth the cost, as the pursuing Romans marched straight into Hannibal's position. The Roman general was killed in the opening minutes of the battle, and the drowned and captured numbered in the tens of thousands. Following his two great victories, Hannibal opened negotiations with Rome's allies. He made a point of releasing many of his captives, only keeping the prisoners from the city of Rome. Hannibal defended this policy by stating, "I did not come to fight against Italians, but on behalf of Italians against Rome." Hannibal bore this mantra out by focusing his pillage exclusively on the estates of wealthy Roman nobles, hoping to inflict as much damage on the Roman economy as possible. In mid-216 BC, after months of intermittent skirmishes, Hannibal received word that a gigantic army of over 80,000 Roman soldiers was marching straight toward him. Although outnumbered almost 2 to 1, the great general quickly realized that this was his chance, and marched his 50,000-man army to Cannae. The Roman army was under the joint command of generals Paulus and Varro. Hannibal knew his opponents well. Paulus was a cautious general, while to Hannibal, Varro was a glory-hungry idiot, and his chosen mark. Due to their equal rank, Paulus and Varro commanded the army on alternating days, so Hannibal simply waited until it was Varro's turn to make his move. When the Roman formation charged the Carthaginians, Hannibal was there in the middle of his troops, mounted on one of his only remaining war elephants. However, the Punic front line seemed to break before Varro's expert application of brute force, as the forwardmost Carthaginian units caved into an inverted crescent. The tightly packed legionaries pressed on, breaking formation as they made contact, and gave Hannibal his chance. Elite Punic infantry swept in from all sides, closing the crescent, while the famed Numidian cavalry cut off any routes of escape from the field. Though smaller in number, the Carthaginians had encircled the mighty Romans, trapping them like cattle in a slaughterhouse. Over half of the legionaries were sent to meet Mithras. Having just won a battle that generals and YouTube historians alike would analyze for generations, Hannibal watched with smug satisfaction as Rome's allies in southern Italy and Syracuse defected en masse. Then, dire news arrived. While Hannibal had been busy in Italy, a small Roman force had arrived in Iberia, and his brother Hasdrubal was now on the defensive. Just as the Barcids had taken matters into their own hands following the First Punic War, a Roman family known as the Scipiones had taken charge of Rome's overseas war efforts, and their armies were now deep in Barcid territory, denying Hannibal any chance of easy reinforcement. Old supporters of Hanno the Great had reasserted themselves in the Carthaginian Senate and were deliberately obstructing any efforts to send Hannibal troops and equipment. Effectively trapped in Italy and burdened by the responsibility of defending his new Italian allies, Hannibal rampaged up and down the peninsula for 9 years. But his enemies had learned the lessons of Cannae well, and Hannibal failed to draw Rome into a decisive engagement. Meanwhile, Hasdrubal was pushed back further and further until he opted to abandon the Spanish provinces entirely and take a 30,000-man army to join his brother in Italia in 207 BC. It was at this point when things began to collapse, when Hasdrubal was intercepted near the Metarus River, where Hasdrubal was killed and his entire army destroyed. Then, the Roman soldiers reconquered Sicily, granting Rome a springboard into North Africa and cutting off Hannibal's army by land and sea. Soon Hannibal was ordered to pull his forces back to Carthage. All of his gains evaporated as his ship left the peninsula. He still hoped to stall Rome long enough for them to sue for peace, but by the time he reached Carthage, the city had already surrendered to the Romans. The Barcids' rivals had negotiated a peace with Publius Cornelius Scipio, commander of the Roman force in Africa. Hannibal and Scipio had met in battle before at the river Tacinos when Scipio was only 16, and the teenager had saved his father from capture at the hands of the Carthaginian army. Hannibal was disgusted with the Senate's naked submission. Just like his father Hamilcar, he had shed blood for Carthage his entire adult life, only to be betrayed and discarded at the last minute. Yet with his arrival in Africa, the old supporters of the Barcid family emerged from hiding and wrestled control of the Senate away from the sycophantic merchants who were ready to give up. With their will to resist rekindled, Hannibal raised a citizen army and hired fresh mercenaries from all across Africa. Then, knowing that this would be his last roll of the dice, the grizzled, one-eyed, 45-year-old Carthaginian general marched out to confront his 33-year-old Roman counterpart in a battle that would decide the fate of his nation. 2 empires would enter, but just one would leave. The final battle of the Second Punic War took place in October 202 BC on the open plains of Zama. Scipio knew this was the best terrain for cavalry and secured Numidian allies of his own. He entered the battle with a third more cavalry than Hannibal and was accompanied by a veteran force of legionaries. Meanwhile, the bulk of Hannibal's forces were citizen militia and local levies. But Hannibal had 80 war elephants deployed at the front of his line, aimed like living battering rams towards the Roman center. Before hostilities commenced, Hannibal and Scipio met in the field. Their conversation was brief, a chance to size up the opposition. Perhaps under different circumstances, they could have called each other friends. Hannibal gave a pre-battle speech to his elites, congratulating them on the great victories they had shared in the past. He reminded his levies of their duties and what was at stake if they lost. Finally, he ordered his elephants to charge. Unlike his forebears, Scipio had a counter for Hannibal's beasts. The Romans used trumpets and cymbals to startle the elephants, all while his cohorts were spread in such a way that the elephants had open avenues to charge down and away from the clatter, and as they passed through these funnels, they were pelted with projectiles and killed. Scipio's forces then drove Hannibal's cavalry from the field, depriving him of a crucial component of his army. Once the architect of so many victories through strength and speed of his cavalry, Hannibal watched in horror as his own tactics were employed against him. Once Rome's Numidian allies wheeled around and charged the Carthaginian flanks, the battle was over, and Rome treated Hannibal to a reenactment of Cannae from their perspective. With no options left and Rome at the gates of the capital, the Senate opted to surrender. The Romans were not kind to their conquered foes. Carthage was stripped of all of its overseas territory and saddled with crippling reparations. Most outrageous of all, the peace treaty stipulated that Carthage could not go to war without Rome's permission. Humiliated and subdued, Carthage entered a period of uneasy peace, all the while feeling Rome's heavy blade hanging over their heads. The great Hannibal became a political leader, enacting many sweeping reforms to help restore Carthage's glory. But years later, the Romans, possibly afraid of his continued influence, accused their old foe of conspiring with Rome's enemies, and forced him into exile. Hannibal would die in exile, his dreams of Carthaginian dominance unrealized. Over 50 years after their devastating defeat, Carthage was beginning to rise from the ashes. However, they were continually plagued by raids from their southern neighbor, Numidian king Massinissa. Massinissa was an ally of Rome, and every time Carthage requested permission to defend their land, the Romans refused. In the year 151, the Carthaginian Senate raised an army to stop the Numidian raiders. Treaty be damned. Unexpectedly, the Punic army was defeated by the Numidians, and then the Carthaginians were forced to watch from behind their walls as the Romans mobilized against them. The Romans arrived at the nearby city of Utica with a massive army and demanded that the Carthaginians turn over all of their military equipment immediately. The Senate complied, turning over all of their arms and allowing their fleet to be burned at anchor. With Carthage stripped of its defenses, the Romans made their next demand. The Carthaginians must abandon their city so that the Romans could raze it. Desperate though they were, the proud citizens of Carthage could not accept this. Their delegation quickly returned to the city, recruiting and arming an army for one last hopeless battle at the nearby town of Nephrus. There, the Romans defeated the Carthaginians and proceeded to lay siege to their capital. The Carthaginians endured the siege for 3 years before the Romans breached the walls. They roamed the streets for 6 days, killing and burning, before the survivors finally surrendered to spare the lives of their families. Around 50,000 hostages were taken to be sold into slavery, and they alone lived to witness the final fate of their city. Carthage was pulled down brick by brick, its territory annexed directly into the Roman Republic. The proud elephant of North Africa was feasted on by a swarm of Roman eagles. In just over a century, the Republic of Carthage was reduced from a large, wealthy nation with near total dominance over the Western Mediterranean to a smoldering ruin and a ghost of an empire. But even this was not the end of Carthage. A century after its fall, Julius Caesar ordered the city to be rebuilt. The nascent city quickly regrew, and by the 1st century AD, it was the second largest city in the Western Mediterranean. Even long after mighty Rome had snuffed out their old rival, the memory of Carthage endured. Patriarch.